Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, welcome. Good afternoon. It's really my distinct pleasure to open today's discussion on a project of profound importance and meaning. Opening up this discussion today could not come, I think, at a better time. I would like to start by extending a number of heartfelt thanks. First, my sincere gratitude goes to Metin Arditi and to the Arditi Foundation for initiating this project. First discussion we had with Metin on that project were already in May, June 2023, and for supporting it throughout its journey. It's been both a privilege and a responsibility for the Institute to contribute to this important initiative at a time when radical imagination is definitely more essential than ever, but it is also getting to be rare and actually difficult to sustain. I would also like to express my deep appreciation to Ricardo Bocco, who has coordinated the project and who will be with us online, and to Ricardo Bocco and Nigel Roberts, who also will be joining us, for the intense work that they have both put into co-writing the final version of the text. My thanks go also to all members of the 2 days workshop that we organized at the Institute in 2024, early in the process. And here I would like to remember particularly my late colleague and dear friend, Professor Mahmoud Mohamedou, whose contributions to those discussions were both very significant and deeply valued, and obviously we will miss his voice today. Let me also thank Professor Grégoire Mallard, who was also present during those meetings and early conversation and has accepted to moderate today's sessions. Finally, last certainly not least, my warmest thanks to Professor Yael Berda and to Professor Ibrahim Said, who are joining us today and who have agreed to discuss both the text and the project that it carries. In 1946, Martin Buber, Judah Magnes, and Moses Smilansky authored a brief yet profoundly visionary text titled Palestine, a Binational State. In this document, they laid out a bold proposal for a shared political future between Jews and Arabs in the land of Palestine. Rather than endorsing partition or exclusive national sovereignty, the authors advocated for a binational framework, one grounded in parity, cooperation, and mutual recognition. They envisioned a model of shared sovereignty, one rooted in equal representation, autonomous cultural development, and joint governance. Notably, they drew several parallels with the Swiss model, highlighting its relevance to their vision. Their proposal was not naive, and they acknowledged inherent tensions and contradictions. Yes, yet it undeniably was a utopia of the very positive and pragmatic kind, offering a necessary horizon, one which came with a deep ethical commitment to just and fair coexistence. In 1947, the authors presented their text and the vision it embodied to the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP. UNSCOP had received and reviewed several proposals concerning the future of Palestine, ultimately retaining only two, the proposal from Buber et al. And a partition plan. The federal state proposal, that is the Buber et al. Proposal, received support from only 3 of the 11 members of the committee, 1 member abstained, and 7 members actually endorsed the second project, which proposed to divide the territory in 2 independent states. One might say the rest is history. But it is indeed interesting to ask what would have happened had UNSCOP endorsed the proposal, the Buber et al. Proposal, instead of the 2-state solution, and had the UN General Assembly subsequently adopted it as a resolution. At a moment when time seems ripe to start thinking about the day after, it's certainly worth revisiting the idea of a one-state federal solution grounded in principles of equality and justice. This is precisely, and has been since the start, the focus of the project that we will discuss today. It would be easy to dismiss such a proposal as deeply unrealistic in the current climate, and indeed this claim holds weight. Yet perhaps it's exactly this improbability that makes the conversation necessary, an invitation to expand our horizon of thought and reimagine what is possible. And to make that point and end my few words, I would like to actually quote a short abstract from a recently published book by Dominique Hédé, La mort est en train de changer, the translation is mine, We must allow ourselves the right to imagine a world in which one can be Israeli, Lebanese, Jordanian, Syrian, or Palestinian within a new framework, a new mobility, a new mode of exchange, a new conception of citizenship, a form of equality and coexistence that transcends and overturns religious and nationalist norms. A utopia? Yes, of course, but utopia here must be understood as fundamentally different from an ideal, not as the projection of a fixed desire, but as the meeting place of contradictory desires seeking a shared rooms. Thank you very much to all of you for being here today, and I leave the floor to Metin Aditi.
Hello, good day. I thought I would speak French, but as I understand it, Ibrahim doesn't understand French, so a little bit. Okay. In any case, the problem is complex enough so that we put all chances on our side. Very briefly, what's the genesis of this project? There were many occasions in the last 3 years, not 2 years, but 3 years, during which we all felt powerless. And I must admit that the day I felt the most powerless was not October 7, 2023, because I largely expected it. Of course, I was horrified by the crimes, but for many months, I was expecting some kind of brutal expression of revolt. I thought it would come from the West Bank. I was wrong. But the day I felt the most powerless was November 1st, 2022. This is the day when there were the last elections to the Knesset. And the cards were all on the table, and they were open. And that evening, I knew that disaster was looming. I had planned to go to Israel a couple of weeks later because the three winners of my foundation's theatrical competition were being presented in Tel Aviv, and that was to be, as every year, a very nice and intense evening. I canceled my trip. I kept, of course, the event, but I said to Ariel Porat, the president of the University of Tel Aviv, who was acting as the coordinator between my foundation and the various Israeli universities, I said I stopped. And I said I stopped because I don't want to be an alibi. Things will not be the same as before, and this is exactly what we're witnessing. It was a deep shock. And in January, the very first day of January of 2023, what was expected happened. That is to say, Netanyahu created a coalition with the extreme right, with the extreme right, the extreme of the extreme right, with parties who, at one point in time in the history of Israel, were just forbidden, declared illegal. And I thought, what can I do? What can I do from where I am in Geneva? And I just made a very quick analysis. And I thought, there are three possibilities in front of us, or let's say in front of Israel. The first possibility is the status quo. Things continue as before. And this is, I thought and still think, a recipe for more brutal events. Of course, October 7 was yet to come, but nevertheless, I thought this is a recipe for disaster. The second possibility was a two-state solution. The two-state solution, in my eyes, was doubly let's say, dangerous. The first danger was that we would spend a lot of time on that, and that had been the case for many, many years without any kind of solution far away. And the second danger was that those who propose or think of or try to push a two-state solution already have some kind of reward. They say, well, we did our best, we did what we could. That's typical of, for example, Mr. Macron, who proposed a two-state solution with one of the two states being demilitarized, which is, again, a recipe for more troubles. Beside that, I don't see how we can envisage a two-state solution without removing the settlements. That is to say, removing somewhere between 650 and 700,000 people, when we know what happened in 2005, when there were only 8,000 settlers to be removed from Gaza, and Gaza is not a biblical land like, as they say, Judea and Samaria. And it was a trauma in Israel. So what happened in 2005 may be a lesson of what would happen if some kind of a major decision was made to remove the 650 or 700,000 settlers. So I think nothing would prevent a civil war from that. What is left? One-state solution, and what I thought was a credible way to approach the problem was that we took as an example or as an inspiration the Swiss formula. That is to say, by imagining cantons or districts or departments, you name it, where there would be in every case a solid majority, be it of Israeli Jews or Israeli or whatever Palestinians, so that, and these cantons would be, of course, given a constitution, a cantonal constitution, which would encompass major areas of decisions, and especially religion and immigration, so that this solution could be the closest we could think of a two-state solution where every, not minority, but every identity would feel home and safe. And maybe this solution, I thought, would be workable from a legal standpoint. And this is when I asked Marie-Laure to examine the possibility that the Graduate Institute invites a number of specialists in constitutional law to examine and conclude whether this solution is at all workable. I was fully aware that maybe I was all wrong and it couldn't work. We had those meetings, and I must say all this was well before October 7, as Marie-Laure mentioned. And then she asked Ricardo Bocco to take the lead. And again, that was before October 7. And as it turned out, after 4 days of meetings with very brilliant persons in Geneva, this was at the end of January 2024, it turned out that this solution seemed workable. And we had those meetings, and then Ricardo and his colleagues wrote the report that you know of, and that was it. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Grégoire Malin. I'm Director of Research at the Institute and Professor of Sociology. So let me briefly introduce the speakers. In general terms, you have their biography on the website, so you can see their institutional affiliation. But just to tell you two things. My first point is why the composition of this panel might seem puzzling, considering what Metin has just said, that he has asked originally constitutional law scholars to think about a one-state federal solution. Most of them are not constitutional law scholars. They are historical sociologists, development economists, historical sociologists doing projects in development like Ricardo, who has had a long career at the Institute of Development. Before, it was the International Institute, the Geneva Graduate Institute we know of. That is actually coloring the report that you may have read of Ricardo. There's a lot of consideration about the question of economic rights and the question of development within this new federal or confederal compact. It's not a purely constitutional law report. And you will hear this very clearly articulated in Ricardo and Nigel's presentation, and in Yael and Ibrahim's presentations. The second point of why this is not puzzling is because this interdisciplinarity has been the DNA of our institute since its founding. So if you're asking to create new states, which is a very common endeavor. You have experts in constitutional law roaming the world to go to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to propose confederal model or federal models, and they all come from constitutional law. And generally, the alternative is between the the German model or some version of the German model, because that was an example of imported democracy that was sustainable. Confederal models are less common. We think of Belgium, for instance, and it's not the best system we think of because it's a system where sometimes they don't have a government for 2 years, but it still works. But at the Institute, we are used to having this interdisciplinary understanding of law and international law, and its intricate enmeshment in the domestic legal order. Since the start, remember the founding fathers of this institute were two people. Paul Salomon Mantoux was a Jewish intellectual, cousin of Dreyfus, was trained at École Normale and part of the Dreyfusard with Albert Thomas, who was the head of the ILO, and hosted a lot of Jewish immigrants during fascism. And William Rappard, a Protestant, a Swiss-American scholar, both of them financial historians, not a surprise, and both addressing very vividly, actually, the question of Israel and Palestine, Mandate Palestine at the time. William Rappard was the longtime member of the Mandate Commission, who actually, in 1937, proposed a one-state federal solution with Swiss canton and Jerusalem as an international mandate. So this approach is actually something that we inherit from the past, that we think through these different generations of scholars. William Rappard, less critical of colonization than Ricardo's report, and as Ibrahim will say. But I wanted to remind you of where you are intellectually before you have the presentation of Ricardo and the others. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for those who are attending in presence, and to Nigel, who is attending online from Washington. It's probably, I guess, the earliest conference in his life at 6 a.m. in the morning that Nigel is accepted to do. Now, We will present the 5 parts of our reports that was concluded actually after 3 versions in October 2024, and finally the version that you can find on the website of the Institute in open edition is the latest January 2025, which is a shortened version of the 3rd version. Having worked for the past 44 years on the Middle East, where I lived several years between Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, the occasion to work on this project was very thrilling for me because 35 years out of the 24 spent working in and on the Middle East were devoted to Palestine and to the conflict. Now, before entering in the specific of our report, I'd like to highlight a few items. Because since the Trump plan has become public, well, everybody, I suppose, is happy that so far the genocide has been stopping. Let's hope that the ceasefire will keep going. But since many people have begun talking about the beginning of a durable peace, I am quite cautious about that. And this is where our report can find its meaningful place. So I said that there are 3 items that I would like to highlight, which are contained in the last part of our report. So let's begin by the end, and then we'll go through all of it. The first item is that if we are aiming to reach a peace, there is a need to look and modify the narratives that both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arab have. In particular, the version of the Israeli Jews and part of the Jewish diaspora. Why? First of all, I think that one of the main problems is that the Jewish Israelis and part of the diaspora are trapped into the Shoah, what I call the Shoah complex, meaning that the trauma of the Shoah doesn't seem yet to have been digested, overcome. Actually, it is the opposite that seems to have happened, meaning that the successive Israeli governments have been pointing to the fact that we, the Jews, are the victims. We are the victims. We are the victims. We are the victims. And in that, they were comforted by the support of most Western countries, who actually do not seem to have helped Israel, the Israeli Jews, and part of the diaspora to overcome the horrible trauma that has become an intergenerational trauma for the Jews. On the other side, the Palestinians as well lived an important trauma that has repercussion until today. It is an intergenerational trauma caused by what is called in Arabic the Nakba. The Nakba, meaning the catastrophe, was basically the results of the 1948 war, where more than 750,000 Palestinian Arabs were expelled from the Mandate Palestine, which, by the way, fully contradicts the Israeli motto that the Holy Land was a land without people for a people without land. I mean, they should explain why there were 750,000 refugees. Israel raised more than 500 villages, Palestinian villages, etc., etc. Now, if we want to reach peace, one of the first items to address is how the narratives of the two partners for peace, Israelis and Palestinians, should be modified. I mean, the Palestinians should also take into account more consciously what the Shoah is meant. The second item I would like to highlight is the question of the occupation and the colonization. In 1967, after the Six-Day War, Abba Eban, at the time Israeli ambassador at the United Nations, Abba Eban contributed to the writing of Resolution 242 of 1967. But in his memoirs, it is very interesting to read that Abba Eban had a very intense exchange of letters with Moshe Sharet, who at the time was the Israeli prime minister. And Abba Eban was urging Moshe Sharet to end as quick as possible the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, basically saying, if we do not pull back, the occupation will become our cancer. And tragically, I think that Abba Eban was right, because the occupation and the colonization have become a sort of a cancer for Israeli society insofar as the Israeli army, in its work as an occupying army, has not defended what most Israeli authorities define as being the most moral army in the world, because since the beginning of the occupation, the work of the occupation Israeli army has been consisting of harassing Palestinians, finding collaborators among the Palestinians, imprisoning Palestinians, eventually torturing them. Now, the question of occupation, which is not touched upon in the 20 points plan of Trump, is another key element to take into account. Finally, last but not least, the request of disarming Hamas. Why not? The question is that if Hamas has to be disarmed, I think that at the same time, the ultra-Orthodox Messianic settlers should be disarmed as well. And I can develop later on if you wish, but I think that we should look at both Hamas and the Messianic ultra-Orthodox Jews as the byproduct of the two Palestinian and Israeli political systems. They are not just out of the blue, and they reveal a lot about both societies. I stop here for the moment, and I leave the floor to Nigel, who will tell us for the first, second, and third part of the report. I will come back later. Thank you.
Thank you, Riccardo. And thank you all for coming today. Briefly, my background and involvement in Israeli and Palestinian affairs stems from 14 years working with the World Bank, 5 of those in Jerusalem, and helping to try and implement the economic aspects of the Oslo Agreement. And that is why, when I was asked to help write this paper on alternative futures, that I wanted to start by disabusing people of the notion that the Oslo variant of a two-state solution should be resurrected. This is all that you hear from governments and diplomats whenever they look past the Gaza war, while at the same time being very careful to avoid explaining how and why they should continue with an approach that has manifestly failed for the last 30 years, while deepening Israeli occupation and leading to growing radicalization of both societies. So thus the paper begins by examining the structural flaws of the Oslo variant of the two-state solution. And to be brief here, we identify 5 factors. First is the lack of commitment by the government of Israel and also by maximalists on both sides. Second is the false promise of a confidence-building process between 2 deeply distrustful peoples under a continuing occupation and aggressive colonization of the West Bank. Third, the extreme disparity in the coercive power of the 2 sides that enabled Israel to shut down the Palestinian economy through restrictions on movement, on labor flows, and on the transfer of clearance revenues from Israel to the Palestinian Authority. Fourth, the failure of United States and Europe, who, after all, helped dispossess the Palestinians in the first place, to act as the referees of the process, especially in relation to settlement expansion, but also to during the negotiation process itself. And finally, the failure not only to conclude any of the final status issues, but to even seriously discuss 2 of the bellwether issues, the future of settlements and the return of Palestinian refugees. So where are we today, more than 30 years later? The settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem have increased from 275,000 to roughly 700,000 today. And the refugee population with a right of return has increased from 2.8 million to 6 million. At the same time, what we witness, sadly, is a deterioration of support on both sides for a just settlement, particularly in Israel. A Pew poll in January of this year showed that support for a 2-state solution of any variant in Israel had declined to around 20% of the population, while a recent Penn State poll showed that of those surveyed, 82% of Israelis favored the expulsion of Gazans from Gaza, and over 50% expulsion of Israeli Arabs from Israel. Palestinians remain somewhat more supportive of a settlement, if less than in the 1990s. So the PSR in May 25 polled Palestinians around a 2-state solution and found that support for that still stood at around 40%. And if you then conceived of a 2-state solution along the lines of the 1967 ceasefire lines, in other words, devoid of all settlements, support rose to around 60%, but still support much less than it was earlier on in the process. So before getting into the details of federation, our paper lays out what the three types of option are going forward. The first is a continuation in some form of what is happening now, which is one state under two systems. But in all probability, a deteriorating status quo with continued expansion of settlements in the West Bank and perhaps in Gaza, potential expulsions of Palestinians, continuing violence and resistance, and further international condemnation of Israel. In other words, not a happy or a viable way of proceeding. The second set of alternatives surround a single, presumably democratic and rights-based space covering all of Mandate Palestine. This is something we did not go into in any detail because we believe this was a non-starter for Israel until or unless its coercive power is significantly diminished. In other words, nothing in the foreseeable future would make that acceptable. And that leaves you with some variant of two entities, a Palestinian and an Israeli entity, in a greater or lesser degree of interdependence, either as two separate states or as a federated state or as a confederated state. Now, as you know, our paper sets out the possible parameters of a federation, which is in many ways similar to the confederation proposed by A Land for All and other organizations currently. And I won't go into the differences here, but rather stress one very important similarity between the A Land for All proposal and ours. Both offer the same solution to the major stumbling blocks of the Israeli settlements and the Palestinian refugees and their return. In the case of a federation, however, that solution would be enshrined in a federal constitution. I guess at this point it's worth repeating that under international law, it's quite clear that Israeli settlements in occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem are illegal and should be dismantled. And under various UN resolutions, the Palestinian refugees and their descendants have a right of return to their former homes in Israel. Now, as long as Israel has the power to resist these dictates of international law, it will do so. And we therefore decided to look at a compromise that we felt both parties might possibly agree to. In other words, we took a pragmatic route informed by, but not determined by, the dictates of international law. And that compromise in our paper begins by distinguishing between residency and citizenship. Thus, for example, a Palestinian refugee returning to Israel would become a citizen of Palestine, but a resident of Israel. He or she would have a right to vote in elections for a Palestinian parliament, but not the Israeli parliament, while being subject as a resident to Israeli law. The same would apply for Israelis who resided in the Palestinian state or territory or entity, whatever you would call it under a federation. They would vote in Israel while resident in Palestine, but would be subject to Palestinian law. And in this way, the Palestinian and the Israeli majorities in each of the territories of the federation would not be threatened. further practical compromises would likely be necessary. So, for example, in the refugees, it might be that through a process of negotiation, only a certain number would be agreed as those who would return to Israel, alongside recognition, memorialization, and different scales of compensation, depending on who went where and who came from where, and indeed who decided to stay behind and not return to the Federation at all. As for the settlers, possible compromises might include land swaps along the existing border of the West Bank and Israel in return for land of equivalent size and value. It might also, and probably would need to include limitations on the numbers of settlers who remain behind in the West Bank, current West Bank, as well as opening settlements to Palestinian ownership and residence, as well as that of Israelis. Many other vital facets of a federation are detailed in the paper, and I don't propose to go through those now because we don't have time. They include the future of Jerusalem, security arrangements, legal and judicial system, economic integration, the nature of a federal constitution, and the division of powers between the federation and the state or the entities, parliamentary structures, and also federal administrative structures. And while we do see practical solutions to all of these questions, including to that of refugee return and the future of settlements, the key, as Ricardo has already said, is to get to a position where both societies are able to see and recognize one another and to overcome the mutual trauma that they have both been subjected to. A process that is extremely difficult, but has to begin with what I would call narratives of recognition, of both sides being able to tell their stories and have those stories heard by the others. Question that Ricardo and I have asked ourselves as we went through this process is, what happens next? You have a report here, the result of a process of discussion and thinking, an extended nature, but what happens next? What we'd like is to see this report used to convene public intellectuals from Israel and Palestine to discuss not only this report, but whatever future alternatives come out of a process of exchange of this kind. It's clear they would be able to improve on what we've written. It is by no means flawless. It's if you like, our way of trying to open up a discussion. And also to break the dead policy hand of the two-state solution that is still the default in discussions among diplomats. And I would hope and I would ask that the Geneva Graduate Institute consider the possibility of convening that group of Israelis and Palestinians to take this process forward. Another critical question is how to, if you like, socialize a dialogue of this kind among those groups most directly involved in any future settlement, by which I mean the Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians in Gaza, the Israeli citizens in Israel, the Palestinian citizens in Israel, the Palestinian refugee communities, and the Palestinian and Israeli diasporas, or Jewish diasporas. This would be a complex, politically dangerous, expensive and lengthy process, but momentum towards a realistic solution has to be created outside the political structures that both the Palestinians and the Israelis have created, since those structures have thus far been unable to resolve this, the problem of this 100-year-old plus conflict. Let me just close with a quotation, which is actually in our report, from Leila Farsakh, who was herself a participant in the original seminar. She writes that it's the success of any constitutional design for a democratic, decolonized polity, be it binational, federal, or confederal, will hinge on the willingness of those involved to work and live together as equals. It requires engaging with the enemy and confronting the issue of historic responsibility by developing mechanisms for reconciliation, both between Israel and the Palestinians, and also within Israeli and Palestinian societies. And I'll stop there.
If I may add, thank you, Nigel, for the very clear presentation of our report. As you understand, we set a number of principles, also suggestions. We can come back during the debate, for example, on how to address the question of the implementation of the Resolution 194 of December 48 concerning the right of return and or compensation for Palestinian refugees, or the status of Jerusalem. I mean, all a number of items that are definitely possible problem ahead. Now, what definitely we lack in terms of data to make any hypothesis is the fact that we do not know what Palestinians in the diaspora and Jews in the diaspora think and want. Meaning that, for example, on the Palestinian side, and this is quite interesting, 8 months ago, Hamas asked Abu Mazen, the president of the Palestinian Authority, to reconvene the Palestinian National Council. The Palestinian National Council has nothing to do with the Palestinian Legislative Council. The Palestinian National Council is an international body representative of the Palestinians worldwide. And this was created by the PLO. But since 2005, Abu Mazen has decided not to reconvene it, and he has been managing his agreements or discussions with Israeli in part via the Palestinian Legislative Council. So we do not know what Palestinians worldwide would like, including the Palestinian refugees. On the Israeli and Jewish side, on the Jewish diaspora, to my knowledge, there is not an equivalent of the Palestinian National Council. What we know is that during the past 2 years, part of the diaspora in the US, and especially among the youth, has claimed that they do not feel to be represented by Israel as Jews. But still, we don't know what is their vision for the future. Would they want a two-state solution a la Oslo? Would they prefer a federal or confederal state? Meaning, Nigel mentioned correctly the A Land for All initiative. There is the other initiative, the Holy Land Confederation also. These are all proposals done by jointly by Israeli and Palestinians, which is very much important, much more than our report in some way, because both Nigel and myself, we are not Palestinians or Jews, we are Europeans. And it is actually as Europeans that we are speaking. Because to be frank, I feel more and more ashamed by the European attitude, not to speak about Switzerland. So one key element we are lacking is to know what is the wish and the will of both diasporas. Yeah, I think that if you agree, Nigel, we can leave the floor to our discussants to listen to their points. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for doing this work. I want to take a moment to remember the dead. Let's take a moment to remember the dead of these last 2 years. Because when we go forward with our ideas, we have to think about what is going to happen on the ground. How is life to be lived? How is dignity to be provided? And I'm so happy that we're here at this moment after a ceasefire, but it's a very fragile moment where life still is questioned. What's going to happen now? Who is safe? How do we achieve safety? And so I want to bring us back into that a little bit more emotional space, because that's where people are, and also a space of deep grief and deep anger that is mixed in with this kind of moment of hope. And so we're in this complexity, and it's one of the things I really appreciated about this report. So I'm Yael Berda, and I teach at Hebrew University, but I'm also the co-chairwoman of the board of A Land for All, Two States, One Homeland. It's a very new position since October 1, and with Thabit Abouras. And our movement has grown exponentially in the last few years. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the report, a little bit of how the very strong points I see in its thesis. Then I'm going to go a little bit to critiques of what I think needs to be addressed more. And then what I'm going to try and do is also try and map out the policy field in which these ideas are being talked about. And so very briefly, we obviously absolutely agree with the thesis about the failure of the Oslo process and the idea of partition and separation as solutions that we've seen that have not only failed in practice, but have also created a shadow, a consistent shadow of the other, those that are supposed to live on the other side of an imaginary boundary, meaning not us, them. And that creation of the partition imagination is something that we think we've suffered very deeply from. We think that the ideas of separation, we've seen what happens when there is a strict separation, as was in Gaza, that it, on the one hand, doesn't provide security at all, but does create a dehumanization of the other. And so we are completely on board with the issues of Oslo. We do have a different outlook about do we do away entirely with existing institutions, or what kind of resources, institutional, social, economic, can and should be used in the process of transition. And that's, I'm going to highlight that a few times. Before going into the issue of federation versus confederation, I think that it's obvious that it's necessary to have two territorial entities. We think they need to be states within a larger framework. And the reason for that larger framework is two. One is that for Palestinians, all of the territory between the river and the sea is Palestine. For many religious Jews, and some secular Jews as well, living in Israel, the entire territory of the land of Israel is where they belong, is a homeland. And this already is difficult to hear for people. Sometimes when we go into thousands of rooms, we tell people, don't leave the room, hold on to your chair. You can hear this. You can hear this because it is what it is. We want to look things in the face. And so, given that it's one homeland, which is extremely difficult also for Palestinians to hear because of the colonial past and present, but given this idea of a shared homeland, what I think the report does very well is the decoupling between citizenship and residency. Understanding that boundaries are for countries, not for people. And what I mean by that is that the issue of freedom of movement for Palestinians is as important as the issue of security and sovereignty is for Israelis. You can't do one without the other. And the whole idea, that's why the whole idea of separation, the whole idea of putting billions into security systems meant to separate, into trying to move around this impossible demography in which Palestinians and Jews live side by side, unequally, but across all the territory. So what we say is, hey, let's look at this territory, and instead of saying, how do we move people around and make roads that go above and under and inside and out, how do you change the system by having a rights-based approach, which I think is the highlight of this report. It really gets the idea that rights come first and that rights are the solution. So I think, so the report offers two possibilities, one which is freedom of residence everywhere, and the other is like a limited residency mix. We think that definitely it's a gradual issue, but you need to have freedom of movement everywhere in order to repair the separations. Two things about, we also think that settlers, refugees in Jerusalem are the most important aspects that were kicked, those were the cans kicked down the road and then that blew up in the Oslo process. But we also have to see how the states, because we're talking about a major regime change here, so how would the states think of the return of refugees also as an immigration process? It is return, but it's also immigration. We have to be practical about it. So what would be the policy of the Palestinian state in terms of return? And then what is the relationship between Palestinians returning to the Palestinian state coming into 48? If you're confused, that's okay. You can ask questions after, and also we have this in a lot more detail. So I think that absolutely the decoupling of citizenship from residency is spot on, and freedom of movement. And the issue of everyday cooperation, that's an absolute necessity. The very strange thing is that it happens. It happens on unequal terms. It happens through racial hierarchy. It happens in occupation, but it happens. And then the issue is, how do you achieve equality within this life that has been created? So again, the issue of what resources can you use that already exist? What I think is missing deeply is the issue of collective equality, collective rights. Because you cannot solve this by granting individual rights alone. There must be the redress of that collective equality in order to change the apparatuses that have been created over the last 70 to 90 years, depends if what you're counting from. So a few things that I think are missing and need to be addressed much more deeply are the issue of security governance. And a lot of times this is not a technical issue. It's not a technical issue. You have at the heart of how these societies operate, how they're built, you have people as soldiers, the state, the state as a subsidiary of the military. And this is true for Palestinians as well. People's relationship to society moves not only through their connection to land and political affiliation, but also to their struggle. And so in that sense, security is not just a question of what policing force and what military will govern where. So I think that needs to be addressed, like I said, deeply. Also, what is the democratic sequencing here? How do you gain legitimacy for this regime change? Who ratifies the Constitution? Do you have constituent assemblies? I mean, that's how we see things in a land for all, having two separate parliaments. But you need constituent assemblies that would legitimize the process of the two states within the Confederation framework. And the issue of diaspora participation, I have a lot to say about, especially the question is, are Jews all around the world a diaspora of Israel? Yes or no? This is the first question that we need to ask before. So who gets to decide what happens? And then, the report does a really good job to point to comparative models that can work and be inspiration, but we don't have a concrete pathway to legitimation. And so this is something that really needs to be worked on and elaborated. It's all obviously things that just one needs to work a lot more to integrate. So a little bit about policy. But before that, I just want to say, we have to remember that Palestinians and Israelis are not in a post-national phase. I used to be a binationalist, and then I talked to thousands of people and decided that wasn't the way to go. The question is, how do you create both a political imagination that is far enough as a vision to change the inequality, to bring a really different possibility, while still being grounded in what people can imagine and accept. Okay, so really 2 minutes about these proposals. So at the opening, it was mentioned already, 1947, there is a confederation model already proposed and another federation model. So these are not new ideas, but since 2016, Alpha's proposal is from about 2010. Alpha is a land for all, sorry, I forget. So since 2016, we have the Holy Land Confederation that is much more similar to a two-state. That's Yossi Beilin and Hiba Husseini. And they have this operational blueprint that they worked on. And they emphasize a permanent resident status across the border. So there's that issue as well, and a Jerusalem Joint Committee. So I already spoke about a land for all. The Century Foundation, and especially Dalia Scheindlein, wrote in 2025, Two States Together. So it's a really public-facing confederation program that has complete, concrete policy levers and opinion pathways. How do you achieve agreements about parts of this program? And there's Omar Rahman at the Brookings Doha Center, who wrote the State Plus. And so it's a hybrid confederation there. And very recently, Chatham House, Yossi Mekelberg, wrote about a two-state confederation with reciprocal residency quotas. So some settlers remain under Palestinian law, a limited right of return, and a 5-year transition period. Now, two very important, one last thing, last point. We are at a moment, despite its fragility, of real hope. Even this most ultra-right-wing government that has denied the existence of the Palestinian people in every way signed on to the agreement that mentions a Palestinian state. There is recognition of a Palestinian state in the world, and there is finally international involvement. This moment is a moment of hope that needs to be carried forward. And that's something that needs sustained and engaged work all the time, obviously in Israel and Palestine, but also in the international community. So I urge you not to let go or let up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ibrahim, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
All right, hello everyone. I would like to start by congratulating Ricardo and Nigel for a serious and technically sophisticated proposal that arrives at a moment of profound moral and political crisis. My comments today provides a critical appraisal and decolonial reading of the proposal. So moving ahead, my argument is structured in 3 subheadings. First, I will situate the proposal within the intellectual tradition that goes beyond separation. I will show how this proposal takes from and contributes to this tradition. Second, I will assess the interdisciplinary foundations to understand which forms of knowledge the proposal engages with and which one it is underrepresented, reflecting on the implications of such underrepresentation on its limitation. And third, I will discuss the practicality and feasibility of the proposal within the current political and geopolitical climate. I've got a lot to say. I hope I manage within the time. Broadly speaking, there are 2 main traditions that have organized thought and policy beyond separation. First, the binational federal and confederal tradition. So the federal tradition is associated with strands of cultural and social Zionism and other non-Zionist intellectuals. The cultural Zionist strand built on Echad Ha'am and is carried forward by Yehuda Magnes and Martin Buber through Brit Shalom and later Echad in the 1940s. It draws on cultural Zionist critique of Herzl's sovereignty-first vision and on ethical humanist traditions that prioritized national renewal over statist power of state power. It understands return, and this is very important, as cultural, ethical, and collective renewal rather than immediate ethno-national sovereignty. In terms of institutional design, it proposes a binational federal arrangement with parity and at the center, and cultural and national autonomy for Arabs and Jewish districts. I'm not going to go into the socialist Zionist binational proposal, but it's important to understand that it focuses on, informed by Austro-Marxism, of notions of national cultural, often not territorial. So it's important to keep that in mind so that we can also reflect on some of Ricardo's and Nigel's work. Now I will move to the non-Zionist critique, which is basically builds on Hannah Arendt, and most recently Judith Butler, in conversation, but distinct from Buber and Magnes. It draws from Republican constitutional theory, pluralism, and ethical critique of ethno-nationalism. It rejects sovereignty, ethno-national statehood, in favor of post-sovereign plurality, equal citizenship, and ethics of cohabitation. Now, it's very important to take Arendt and Magnes together, right? So Arendt trades by national parity and communal consent of Buber and Magnes for a post-sovereign constitutional federation with divisions of power, independent courts, enforceable rights, very much similar to Ricardo and Nigel. Beyond that, we have the confederal turn, which came much later than federation in the 1947 partition plan. It recognizes national self-determination while avoiding hard separation and ethno-national supremacy. It favors interstate coordinations rather than deep constitutional power, sharing constraints, which basically it's completely different than the project promoted by Roberts and Nigel, but this confederation proposal, or at least this confederation vision, within different variants of cooperation, this is what characterized most of the work from Land for All to the recent Chatham House work, and this is where Ricardo and Nigel's contribution. Now, the second strand, and this is also very important to understand, is that moving away from the binational tradition, the second tradition articulates a civic, democratic, and decolonial anti-imperialist horizon. It draws from Arab liberal constitutionalism shaped by Ottoman constitutionalism and Nahda thoughts, and it goes back to the 1920s, visible in the Palestinian Arab Congress, which already by then tried to promote one civil state with minority rights. And this strand moved through decolonial, national, and socialist currents, from an art movement inside Israel in the 1950s to Matzpen inside Israel in the 1960s, and the PLO late 1960s and early 70s democratic secular state. And of course, they've got their limitations, but it's very important to highlight them. Now, these strands move later on to the work of critical scholars like Edward Said, Ilan Pape, Azmi Bishara, among others. Now, the critical articulations of this tradition grounds its horizon in equal citizenship, constitutionalism, and de-ethnicized sovereignty, combining anti-colonial, reparative justice with secular right-based approach. And reparative justice is something very important that most of the approaches that currently are promoted tend to ignore the reparative justice, tend to ignore the decolonial aspect of it. Now, if we try and appraise Ricardo and Nigel's proposal based on that, Boko and Roberts' proposal overlaps both the binational federal tradition and the civic democratic one-state horizon. In form, it revives the binational idea of one political roof with robust territorial self-rule, but replaces open-ended parity vetoes with constitutional supremacy, a direct justiciable Bill of Rights, and independent courts turning Magnus and Buber's anti-domination ethic into enforceable law rather than balancing acts of communal consent. In spirit, it echoes Arendt's sovereignty-limiting federalism and Said and Bishara de-ethnicized equality, placing legitimacy in shared citizenship so coexistence is actually lived, not merely proclaimed. The contribution of Boko and Roberts' design adds the notion of live anywhere, vote at home, citizenship versus residency. Some of it indeed corresponds to live at home, live anywhere, vote at home, very much similar to the land for all proposal. In addition, it introduces subsidiarity-based competence allocation, a balanced federal chamber, and an economic union with equalization, operational devices meant to secure everyday non-domination. Now, what remains insufficiently explicit, however, is the decolonial layer, gaps that risk inscribing domination inside an otherwise liberal federal frame. Now, if we move to the disciplinary foundation, philosophically, the design anchored in pluralist and power-sharing tradition that accepts the endurance of two national identities while rejecting exclusive sovereignty as basis for peace. It aligns with the canons on multicultural democracy and federal pluralism. It adapts consciential insights without importing rigid mutual vetoes, relocating anti-domination to right supremacy, judicial reviews, and calibrated chambers design rather than hard parity, as it often discussed. Now, institutionally, it engages on ideas from comparative constitutional law, conflict resolution practices, and security sector reform, the DDR principles that was discussed. And importantly, it treats peace not as a territorial division, despite the division that is suggested, but as constitutional transformation enforceable through courts and rights. Its comparative lens is judicious. Belgium, Switzerland, and Canada are used to eliminate layered authority and linguistic cultural accommodation, while Bosnia invoked as a caution against frozen, extremely imposed federalism. Now, we will go back to the question of what remains under-engaged. Are the political economy and fiscal federalism tools, equalization, competition, anti-capture safeguards, which is important due to the power imbalance between the State of Israel and the future State of Palestine. Also, the competence allocation doctrine of subsidiarity, proportionality, how does that work? And of course, a worked housing, land, and property architecture, return, restitution, while mentioned, requires more work. Likewise, engagement with the possibilities and limits of national cultural non-territorial autonomy as complement to Federal Bill of Rights could have had an added value, specifically in the questions of Palestinian citizens of Israel, which completely absent from the discussions on that proposal. Now, of course, the proposal on Jerusalem could have expanded more as well, and it could have built on other proposals, which had, I think, developed some interesting robust solutions to that. Finally, and I think this is basically what the point I'm trying to make, is what is missing is also the decolonial, feminist, and sociological lenses that are needed to ensure that constitutional symmetry, which basically this is what the project tries to do, does not leave colonial hierarchies intact. And this is what indigenous scholars have constantly discussed, in the United States, in Canada, and elsewhere. So these omissions are reflected in a number of issues identified that are worth addressing. One is false parity. The proposal framing normalizes parity between Israelis and Palestinians, blaming extremists on both sides, thereby risking false equivalence and obscuring structural domination, occupation, apartheid, dispossession, especially when discussing the Oslo Agreement. Now, the way that the proposal goes about the Oslo Agreement is its implementation, but I think we can't forget that the Oslo Agreement was flawed from inception. Now, there is also no decolonial foundation. The decolonial foundation constitutionally is also somehow weak. Although I heard Nigel, his articulation is way much clearer than in their document. So federalism is offered as a technical fix without constitutive acknowledgement of colonial responsibility. There are no explicit recognition of the Nakba, and only partial procedural gestures on return and restitution is discussed, and this is all left to negotiation. So we're going back to the questions of parity and balance of power. And very important is that sequence matters. Transitional justice is treated as optional, quite, not prior. A viable pathway must be sequence, recognition, truth, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence. Otherwise, we will continue to go back to the same narratives, though Nigel, I think, discussed that this is not the case. Now we go to the security design. So the security design are likely to leave primacy, or the IDF primacy, intact within the Israeli unit. Now, if one side retained the army while the other is demilitarized, sovereignty is so one sovereignty is military backed on the one side and merely declarative on the other side. So federal decisions in this case risk being enforced by a single unit's military, making the shared state look like occupation rebranded. And this is very important because right-wing, both from the Likud party and also settlers movement, a lot of the voices there, they are actually promoting a federal state. How does that look like? It's basically where Israel extended sovereignty, mainly to the West Bank, excluding Gaza. And this is basically, that kind of model. If we don't address the issue of the IDF, we will end up in this situation. So to avoid a hollow federation, the IDF must undergo a process of decolonization, pairing security integration with a truth-telling process that acknowledges the IDF's role in human rights abuses and repetitive measures that can make shared security morally plausible for the Palestinians. Now, Palestinian citizens of Israel, the text, 2 minutes. The text is largely silent on their status and on the identity of the two units. So without de-ethnicizing both units, or at minimum, making sure that, so I would say without de-ethnicizing both units, the proposal discussed, the proposal basically creates some kind of a paradox that the Palestinian citizens of Israel currently face, whereby they have formal equality, but at the same time they are subject to the umbrella of the ethnic supremacy of the Jewish state. And also, if both units are not de-ethnicized, then we risk having a constant constitutional crisis, because then one unit wants to promote its ethnic agenda, and the other, counter the constitution. I will stop here. Thank you very much.